All right. Hey, folks. So today, that is a banana and that is an apple. Because apparently, it doesn't matter what we call stuff. Everything is whatever we want to call it. And so that is the topic of today. Thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments about this one, please pop it down below. What I'm talking about is this: Romanian deadlifts and stiff leg deadlifts. I have heard so many people, and it drives me nuts, say that they're both interchangeable. You can just use them interchangeably. And it's just not true. And not to be a stickler for the English language, but it's important that we stick with the right definitions. Otherwise, stuff just doesn't matter. It doesn't make sense. We need to have a universal, if we're speaking English, there has to be a universal understanding of what one thing is as opposed to another. And it's the same when we're looking at weightlifting terms or bodybuilding terms. We need to know what things are and they need to be agreed upon. So today, I'm going to clarify that once and for all and explain to you the differences between a Romanian deadlift and a stiff leg deadlift. If you have any disagreements with that, pop them down below in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. However, I am going to insist on this because this is the bottom line. So let's firstly look at some examples of Romanian deadlifts versus stiff leg deadlifts and what they look like. So if we go on to my shared screen here, we will start with my buddy Tom Martin doing some ridiculous stiff leg deadlifts at 320 kilos. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is his legs are mostly straight. There's a slight bend in them, and he's touching the floor on every single rep. Apart from that, there is no excessive arch in the back. He's basically just trying to not to die at this stage because it's 320 kilos, which is almost like 700 pounds or whatever it is. So that's one example. If we look at the next example, okay, this is me a few years back doing a stiff leg deadlift of 240 kilos. I'm doing this with a rounded back on purpose. That was the point of the training back then. There we go. And that's also beltless with and that's me being very cringe when I'm younger. So those are two examples of stiff leg deadlifts. Now, the next thing I want to show you is an example of a Romanian deadlift, and this is Jeff Nippard explaining what this should look like. So if we go ahead and look at what Jeff's doing here, because he gives quite a good explanation of this, and actually credit to Jeff, his view is in line with mine. So if you look at what he's doing with the Romanian deadlift there, I'm trying to pause the Romanian deadlift at the bottom position. His back has got an arch in it. You can see his t-shirt slightly crinkled, but you can see that his back has got an arch, and he only takes it down to as far as his flexibility allows. So just to kind of pause and do a stop check of where we are before I summarize with some of my notes. Stiff leg deadlift is always done from the floor to lockout, unless you're doing a specific, deficit variation or partial variation. But the defining feature of a stiff leg deadlift is just essentially, it's a deadlift, but with your legs semi-straight. The end point is always going to be the floor, and the start point is always going to be, or the start point is going to be the floor, the end point is going to be when you stood up, okay? That's the defining features. However else you do things, it's really down to the way you deadlift. So it's just your basic hip hinge. Now, the Romanian deadlift has got a much more stylized way of doing things. And if we look at the origins of the Romanian deadlift, it was specifically used as an assistance exercise for the Olympic pulls. So that whole idea is your back should be really, really arched, okay? Really, really strict. And as a result, you're not getting a great deal of lower back or upper back flexion in the Romanian deadlift. You're mostly flexing at the hamstrings and at the glutes. So remember those two things in mind. Okay, now we're going to move on to my notes and look at this more specifically. So here we go. I have to kind of switch in between the middle of the video. All right, so now if we have a look here. So firstly, covering the start and end point of the Romanian deadlift. The Romanian deadlift ends at the sensible limit of flexibility. That's the defined endpoint. So for somebody like me, I'm not that flexible in the hamstrings for whatever reason, okay? So my endpoint for Romanian deadlifts is going to be just below the knees. It's not going to be at the floor. I just don't typically do that very well. And if I want to remain extremely strict with my form and pushing my butt back out, making sure I'm flexing at the glutes, making sure I'm contracting the hamstrings, then I can't go right the way to the floor unless I actually flex my back a little bit. So I might flex my upper back or my mid back or my lower back slightly. So the Romanian deadlift is defined by flexibility as your limiting factor of your range of motion. Whereas a stiff leg deadlift, you can bring in other areas to flex. You just need to touch the floor. So if somebody is built with very suitable leverages for the Romanian deadlift, or they're just very flexible, they might be taking it from the floor. Or for some people, particularly hyper-flexible women, they might be able to do a Romanian deadlift and go beyond the floor and maybe do a deficit. But that's it. So, but the defining feature is your flexibility. So a Romanian deadlift is going to always look different from one person to the next. The defining feature is your back position, which must be arched, and you're only flexing at the glutes and hams. So where you end is where you lose the ability to flex anymore, and you would have to, round your upper back or lower back to go any further. That is the key to the Romanian deadlift. If you take nothing else from this video, take that. That is the key to the Romanian deadlift. It's always going to look different from one person to the other because it is based on the limits of your flexibility, because you have to ensure you're only flexing at the glutes and at the hamstrings. You are not flexing at the lower back or the mid back to get a further range of motion. That makes it very different from a stiff leg deadlift. And on this point, I just want to cover what some people say: Romanian deadlift starts from the top and a stiff leg deadlift starts from the bottom, and that's the difference. That is, quite frankly, the most moronic thing I've ever heard. It's the most moronic and irrelevant thing I've ever heard, because it says nothing about how your people are actually performing the exercise. You can take a deadlift from the top and do it from the top like many people do. So just saying a Romanian deadlift starts from the top is ignoring a whole slew of information about how to actually perform the deadlift. So anytime I hear that, I just think, that person is so stupid. So it just, not to be mean or anything, but it's just such an irrelevant point. And you hear so many really big time fitness coaches say idiotic things like that. It's not true at all. You can take a deadlift from the top. You can take a Romanian deadlift from the bottom as long as your flexibility allows. So it's a moronic point. So let's just put that one to rest right now. So just to kind of summarize this slide here, Romanian deadlift always ends at the limits of the sensible limits of your flexibility. There is no predetermined end point. It's not like we're going to end at the floor. It is defined by the sensible limits of your flexibility of your glutes and your hamstrings. That is all. And if you want to get any further, then you have to bend your back or lower back, mid back, upper back. And that's when you start to delve into stiff leg deadlift territory, which I think is probably why coaches and a lot of coaches and people say that they're interchangeable terms. They are not interchangeable terms. Again, apple, banana. We have the English language for a reason. Okay. So next up, we have stiff leg deadlift. Now, stiff leg deadlift always ends at the floor or starts at the floor, however you want to say, unless it's specifically a deficit or a partial version. So to get more flexibility for the stiff leg deadlift, you utilize flexibility in the upper back and mid back. This is why I showed you the video of me deadlifting 240, stiff leg deadlifting 240, because it shows a high degree of flexion in the mid back. So I wanted to point out that I can't do Romanian deadlifts all the way to the floor because my flexibility in my hamstrings and glutes don't allow me to do that. But I can do stiff leg deadlifts from the floor because I make up for the range of motion by flexing more in my back. So essentially, the stiff leg deadlift is a deadlift without the quads. The legs should be stiff with a slight bend, but not fully locked. And that is the defining feature of a stiff leg deadlift. Basically, a stiff leg deadlift there are no constraints in terms of flex. There shouldn't be any constraints in terms of flexibility for a stiff leg deadlift because there are 3 points at which you can gain more range of motion. That is the hamstrings, the glutes, and the back. And if you break the back up into 3 different territories, lower back, mid back, and upper back, well, there are 6 points of change there. So stiff leg deadlift should almost always be done from the floor to the top. Okay, well, it's very different from a Romanian deadlift. So stiff leg deadlift, think of it as the form is defined, predetermined. It's from the floor to standing up. Romanian deadlift is standing up to the limits of your individual flexibility and then back up again. If you're very inflexible, it's not going to be very much. If you're hyper flexible, it might be super high. Okay, so think of that as the difference of the stiff leg deadlift and the Romanian deadlift in terms of form. Now let's look at what they're used for. So Romanian deadlift, if we look at both of these lifts in terms of 2 categories, typically the Romanian deadlift is, in the muscle building perspective, it's mostly used for the glutes and hamstrings, simply because those are the body parts that flex. It's typically not used to build a lower back unless you're looking to build your lower back isometrically, okay, because the lower back doesn't flex. So something like a hyperextension might be a better choice for the lower back because it actually flexes the lower back through load. But then again, lower back is one of those areas where people don't necessarily want to flex it through load. So perhaps just building isometrically is enough, but that's okay. As long as we acknowledge that in a Romanian deadlift, the lower back is only used isometrically That is, it doesn't flex, it stays in the same position. It's mostly as a glute ham builder because they flex. In terms of a sporting context, well, this is specifically to build the hip drive for Olympic lifting. So this doesn't have as much carryover in powerlifting, in my opinion, because you would be better off just doing a stiff leg deadlift in that case, because this has far more carryover to versions of a hip hinge where you have to be super strict, as in an Olympic lift, like a power clean, a power snatch. For a deadlift, as in a powerlifting context, you're better off just doing a stiff leg deadlift because that approximates what you're supposed to be doing far more closely. And it builds those muscles far better. So it builds the lower back better, it builds mid back better, the upper back better, because you may actually flex depending on what your body needs. So that's the use of Romanian deadlift from both a muscle building perspective and a sporting perspective. Muscle building, primarily glutes, hams, and isometrically the lower back. In a sporting context, it builds hip drive for Olympic lifting because you're reinforcing that position which you need to do the Olympic fast pulls. Like no one does a fast pull with a rounded lower back. That's crazy. So the stiff leg deadlift, in terms of uses, is used as a muscle builder really for the entire posterior. This is what makes it typically such an amazing exercise and typically such a heavier exercise than the Romanian deadlift, because it literally builds everything right from the upper back, traps area, mid back, lower back, glutes, hams, everything. Okay, everything across the posterior. And generally, those areas will all flex. So from a muscle building perspective, this is the premier muscle builder as far as I'm concerned. And in a sporting context, this is used to build the posterior for powerlifting. Now, you might sit there and argue, well, I do a Romanian deadlift for powerlifting. Congrats. Happy for you. Wonderful. You do you. But what I'm saying is, if you are going to be doing a Romanian deadlift to build your deadlift, you may as well just do a stiff leg deadlift in that case, unless you're specifically looking to build the hip drive. If you are, cool. But what I'm saying here is, with the stiff leg deadlift, you can build the hip drive and you can build the back and the glutes and all that kind of stuff far better. So it far more approximates a deadlift than a Romanian deadlift. Romanian deadlift might be a good muscle builder, which indirectly helps your deadlift. But if you're looking for a direct variation, it will be the stiff leg deadlift. So that is my sort of stance on Romanian deadlifts and stiff leg deadlifts. I do think it's important to be finicky about this, and I don't actually think it's being finicky. I think it's important to be clear on definitions, because I've heard a lot of coaches say that they're just basically interchangeable. They are not. There are specific uses for either one, and those are the specific uses as I've laid out. They work different things in different ways. They are subtly different, but that doesn't mean that we can just classify them as the same thing. It's important to have standards and definitions, because that is the basis of human language and communication. Yep. So again, going back to the example, that is why an apple is indeed an apple and it is not a banana. So with that, I will see you guys next time.